Hello all, I would like to present to you Cerberus channels, which is co-authored with Zeta, Avarikioti and Roger Wattenhofer. My name is Orfeas, Stefanos, Thyfronitis, Litos. We will see how we will give an alternative construction for Watchtowers in Bitcoin, which is incentive compatible. So first let's remember what payment channels are, and we will speak specifically about the Lightning Network. Let's say that Alice and Bob have some Bitcoin on the Bitcoin blockchain, and they know that they will transact with each other very often. So they would like to avoid having to pay each time the fees and to wait for many confirmations for their transactions. So what they do is that they create one on-chain transaction called the funding transaction, which essentially puts all their coins in a joint account or a vault, if you please. And then they hold on off-chain a commitment transaction, which reflects the balance of the two players. It reflects how much coins of those in the vault each player has. And the magic trick that Lightning allows, and payment channels in general allow, is to update this commitment transaction to other versions with other balances, reflecting payments from one party to the other, and this can be achieved completely off-chain and with interaction only between the two parties. Therefore, it can happen very, very fast. So, in order to close a blockchain, a Lightning channel, one of the two parties has to submit this commitment transaction on the chain. In the case, we look specifically at the case where Bob has become uncooperative, while Alice wanted to close the channel. As we see, there already exists the funding transaction in a much older block, arbitrarily older block, and Alice at some point in time just unilaterally publishes the commitment transaction. However, to also protect Bob from a malicious Alice, there has to be a dispute period which starts with the submission of the commitment transaction, during which Alice cannot take her funds. Why is that so? Because Alice may choose not to publish the latest commitment transaction, which should be the only valid one, because it reflects the current balance of the channel, but she may instead choose to publish an older commitment transaction, which may be beneficial for her because the balance was more in her favor. And unfortunately, because all these commitment transactions are held off-chain, the blockchain cannot know, the miners cannot know whether the commitment transaction that was published is the latest one or not. And so, to mitigate this problem, we have this dispute period during which Bob, if he sees that the commitment transaction is not the most recent one, can publish the revocation transaction, as it's called, which ensures that the entire funds, all the funds of the channel, will be given to him as a punishment for Alice. So in order for Alice to successfully mount such an attack of committing an older commitment transaction to the blockchain, she has to attack Bob. And there are various ways in which she could attack him. For example, she could DOS his machine, he could and therefore prevent him from acting upon the invalid commitment, the old commitment. Or she could eclipse attack Bob's node, which would result in Bob not even seeing the commitment transaction, or it could also result in the malicious nodes that surround Bob to never relay the revocation transaction to honest nodes and therefore to miners, therefore blocking the revocation transaction from ever entering the blockchain, and various other ways to attack. So if Bob is a client that doesn't want to engage into having a very robust network connection with redundant nodes and things like that, there is currently available the possibility for Bob to outsource this task of watching the blockchain to so-called Watchtowers, to which essentially Bob sends the revocation transaction, and then the Watchtowers will watch the blockchain on his stead. Of course, the Watchtowers, being professional, would need to have a big redundancy and would be very hard to attack by Alice. Therefore, such attacks would not succeed in case Bob employs a Watchtower, and the revocation would almost definitely end up on chain. The thing is, why be a Watchtower? As we already said, being a Watchtower could be expensive and error-prone and is an entire business to run. So there has to be some kind of compensation for Watchtowers. Unfortunately, in the current form of the Watchtowers solution, Watchtowers are only paid when fraud is detected and prevented. Specifically, what happens is that the revocation transaction that is handed over to the Watchtower has a special output that has a special manner in which the Watchtower is paid some of the money of the channel when the revocation transaction enters the chain. However, this creates an incentive issue and a lack of a Nash equilibrium. Well, let's say that Alice knows that Bob is using a Watchtower. Therefore, Alice will be certain that she will not be able to defraud Bob, so she will not try to commit fraud. This means that the Watchtower will never have the opportunity to publish the revocation transaction and therefore will not be paid. And this means that there is no profit for the Watchtower, so the Watchtower will not exist in the first place, because it's not a profitable business to be a Watchtower. In that case, though, the party, Alice, will try to commit fraud more eagerly, because she knows that Bob can't hire a non-existing service. And in that case, the Watchtower would have been paid, because it would have been there to catch the fraud by Alice, and this would have been a profitable business model. As we see, this creates a cycle which is equivalent to not having a Nash equilibrium on whether a Watchtower would exist or not. And we would like to propose a solution to mitigate this problem. One naive solution to that would be to say that, well, it's okay not to pay the Watchtower just at the end, but to pay the Watchtower, for example, on every update, just a very small amount of money, or on a set period of time. However, this has also an incentive problem, because the Watchtower, as we said, would have to do the expensive task of watching the blockchain, and would not, but the payment would not depend on whether the Watchtower offers their service correctly or not. The Watchtower would be paid even if it were inactive, and there's no actual incentive to do its job correctly. So, what the solution to that is to actually have the Watchtower use some collateral, to have the Watchtower lock some money that will be given to Bob in case the Watchtower doesn't do its job. And the rest of the payment would be per update or per some set period of time. So, in order to understand what's going on here, we would have to understand how we change the Lightning channel construction. So we will have to understand the Lightning channel a bit more closely. Let's see some transactions here. Well, we show the funding transaction, which exists on chain right now, because we assume that the channel between Alice and Bob is already open. And we see a number of commitment transactions, all of which can spend the output of the funding transaction. We see the first that has exactly the same balance as Alice and Bob had during the funding of the channel. And we see the various next commitments with different balances for Alice and Bob, as we can see here, 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 and here. And this means that various newer commitments have been created, therefore various updates have taken place. And one important thing to note here, these commitments are held by Alice. There is the equivalent thing held by Bob. And also the second last, not the latest, but the second latest, and all previous transactions, we omit it here, have a corresponding revocation transaction, which is held by Bob. And in case there is a Watchtower in the traditional lightning channels held also by the Watchtower. We note here that in lightning channels as they exist right now, the construction is not changed at all if there is a Watchtower. There's just one slight difference in how the revocation transaction is created in order to have some money go to the Watchtower as well. So this is how lightning channels work, and this is how our Cerberus channels work. We will build slowly up to this design step by step, starting from lightning channels and introducing new features as we go and solving problems that come up as we go. We have to go back a bit before though we start from the lightning channels to introduce some notation to make things clearer and more precise. First of all, there are multi-signatures, which are signatures both by A, let's say here, and B, both by Alice and Bob. These multi-signatures ensure that a particular output will be spendable only if the two parties agree, if both parties provide their signature for this output. Also, we have time locks, delta t here, which ensure that this particular output that is encumbered with a time lock can only be spent after this time lock has expired. And we can combine conditions with and or operators. So let's see here a particular transaction. Well, in this transaction we have two inputs, and what is denoted by the hash is that, well, we don't care exactly about the conditions, but there has to be a signature by A there, which means, in other words, that the first input is controlled exclusively by A, and the same goes for B in the second input. And so we see a very concrete output, however, which has two spending conditions that are separated by an OR. The first way to spend this output, which carries the entire sum, the sum of the two inputs, A plus B, the first way so is to have a signature by A, but also wait for a particular time lock, delta t. The other way to spend this output is to have a signature both by A and B, and this output is not encumbered by delta t. Note here that we will ignore fees for our analysis, but it's very trivial to extend our construction to also include fees. So let's go back to the lightning channels using our notation. The most important changes are here, where the output of the funding transaction is actually a multi-signature between Alice and Bob, and the outputs, as we see the commitment transaction held by Alice, for her output, the script is kind of complicated, and what it says is that Alice can spend this only after the delta t time elapses, or both parties can spend with a multi-signature. And as we see here, the revocation transaction is the one that that actually has these two signatures. And the idea here is that whenever a new commitment transaction is created, when the channel is updated, first Alice is given the new commitment transaction and the necessary signatures for this commitment transaction to spend the funding transaction, and then Alice would send to Bob her signature of the revocation transaction so that Bob can use the revocation transaction for the old commitment transaction that just got invalidated. And this two-step procedure is necessary to ensure that neither party can be defrauded. So we now gradually start to build up to our Cerberus channels. The first step is to assume that, well, there are two time frames, the lowercase t, which is short, let's say that this is just a couple of days, and the longer time frame, t uppercase, which would be very long in the frame of months or even years. And we assume here that the party that employs the Watchtower, Bob, cannot be available in sync with the chain every t lowercase, but it can be in sync. It can sync with the blockchain every t capital, t uppercase. This we believe is a very reasonable assumption, which models the case of clients that are on a mobile phone, for example, who can definitely sync with the chain every now and then, especially if they have funds on the Bitcoin blockchain, but cannot be trusted to come online every few hours. So what we added down here is the collateral transaction, which is funded by the Watchtower, and C can be any sum that reassures Bob. But in the general case, it can be the sum of the inputs to the channel A plus B. If C is equal to A plus B, then it is impossible for Bob to lose any money. And this collateral transaction is spendable by a multi-signature between Bob, the client, and W, the Watchtower, and only spendable by the reclaim transaction, which is held by W. Well, W, the Watchtower, can send this reclaim transaction to the Bitcoin network and then wait for the big time period, the delta T capital, to get their money back. So the idea here is that if a Watchtower wants to cancel their service, they can issue the reclaim transaction, wait out the delta capital T period, and then take their money back. So we have to find a way now to connect this collateral with the Lightning construction. And our first step would be to say, well, let's say that Alice would publish an old commitment transaction. What we can do here is that, just like there is a revocation transaction, there is a penalty transaction, which is held by Bob, and can take the collateral of the Watchtower, plus the money that goes to Alice. However, this is not secure at all, because as we have said, Bob may be away for a period of time longer than delta T lowercase. And this means that the output of Alice will be spendable in a period just when delta T lowercase elapses. And so if Alice colludes with the Watchtower, what they can do is that they can just wait this period out, and then Alice can spend her output, thus succeeding in committing fraud, and then Bob would not be able to publish the penalty transaction because already this output, the one that Alice controls, would have been spent. So to mitigate this problem, we change a bit the configuration, and we have the penalty transaction depending not on the output of Alice, but on an output that is entirely controlled by Bob, which is this one, the output that belongs to Bob. And in order to also ensure that that it's impossible for both the revocation transaction and the penalty transaction to be valid, we connect the output, this output, Bob's output, to the revocation transaction. However, this is not the end of the story, because this creates a problem for the Watchtower. What happens here is that if Alice and Bob collude, what they can do is they can publish the commitment transaction here and the penalty transaction here, one after the other, right away. And this means that there is no time for the Watchtower to publish the revocation transaction, and even if the Watchtower sees the commitment transaction right away and publishes the revocation transaction right away, there is a race between the Watchtower and the revocation transaction, essentially, and the penalty transaction. They cannot be valid both at the same time because they spend the same output, this one, and so only one of the two will be valid. And in at least half the cases, and if Bob has control over some mining power even more often, the penalty transaction will be the valid one, and the Watchtower will lose its collateral even though it was right there, right from the start, and available to send the revocation transaction. So in order to solve this problem, we add this time lock to Bob's output. This means that Bob cannot send the penalty transaction right away, but has to wait for the delta T period. Still, though, there is an attack that can be carried out against the Watchtower, which is kind of more complicated. But what happens here is that this output, Alice's output, is encumbered with time lock when it's spendable by Alice, or by a multi-signature between Alice and Bob. This means that Alice and Bob together can spend this output, Alice's output, not necessarily by using the revocation transaction, but by using any other transaction that they agree to. So what they can do is that they can spend this upper output and in another way, not using the revocation transaction, therefore rendering the revocation transaction invalid. And since there is a time lock here, this means that the revocation transaction would have to wait for this time lock to expire, and therefore, and even if we hadn't had a time lock here, also there would be a race between the revocation transaction held by the Watchtower and whichever transaction Alice and Bob decided to use to spend this first output. So again, that would mean that the first output would be spent, the revocation transaction would be invalid, and then Bob would freely punish the Watchtower, even though the Watchtower was there and available to solve the issue and punish Alice. So to mitigate this problem, we have to add the signature of the Watchtower, to add a multi-signature between the Watchtower and the party that owns each output in both outputs of the commitment transaction. And this is true both for the commitment transactions held by Alice and those held by Bob. So here in this situation, we would have to use the multi-signature for both outputs that go to the revocation transaction, both the inputs used by the revocation transaction, and in the penalty transaction, which is, as we said, controlled by Bob, we would have to use the time-locked output, the time-locked spending method of the output, therefore ensuring that the Watchtower would be able to submit a valid revocation transaction without being in a race with a penalty transaction. Now there's one last issue here that this time goes against Bob. What happens if the Watchtower decides to spend the collateral by publishing the reclaim transaction and then colludes with Alice to spend an older commitment transaction? Well, in that case, the penalty transaction would be invalid because it cannot spend the collateral transaction, which has been already spent by the reclaim transaction. So in order to ensure that this attack can't be carried out against Bob, what we do is that we create a second penalty transaction, which, as far as its first input goes, it works exactly as the first penalty transaction, but its second input does not come from the collateral, but comes from the reclaim transaction, therefore ensuring the same exact value for Bob, while the reclaim transaction is ongoing. So this is the complete construction of Cerberus channels, and to wrap up, I would like to say its pros and cons. First of all, we have proven that this construction is incentive compatible and ensures that Watchtowers are incentivized to work for the client, and at the same time that they are given their due amount of money. It ensures that the employing party can stay offline for an extended period of time, which can be much larger than the time locks used in the channel with regard to the other party. The Watchtowers can withdraw their service unilaterally at any time, and then the client, Bob in our case, would have to choose to either use a different Watchtower, which is possible, or to just fall back to having to watch the blockchain often. And we also offer a Bitcoin proof of concept implementation using the Bitcoin.js library. The limitations that our construction has is, well, one is privacy. The current construction of Watchtowers, the one used by Lightning natively, is a construction that gives very strong privacy guarantees. For example, one thing that is guaranteed is that the counterparty of the client of the Watchtower will not know whether the client uses a Watchtower or not. Also, the Watchtower does not have a lot of information on which updates happen and what is the balance for each update. And also, our analysis is assuming synchronous communication without any delay. But with tuning the time locks, we could extend our construction in a rather straightforward way for the asynchronous setting. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm glad to listen to your questions and answer any of them. Thank you very much.